Hello and welcome to my channel Polyglot Reading. My name is David, and on this channel I talk about books that I read in English, German, Italian, Yiddish or French, and that I'd like to bring to the attention of readers in other than the original language the books were written in. I usually talk about books where translations in many languages are available, and each video is also available in German and in Italian. Let's start right away with my top 10 books read in 2023 for the first time, going language by language. Let's start with the books I read in Italian. Number 1, Zoran Zivkovic, L'ultimo libro. So this first book is a bit out of line because it's a book originally written in Serbian, but I can't read Serbian, so I read the Italian translation. The English translation was published as The Last Book by the Cadmus Press. Zivkovic was a professor at the Faculty of Philology at the University of Belgrade until 2017, but he has also worked intensely as a translator, as an editor, and as an author since the 1990s. He writes very original prose of sort of a fantastic literature, often on bibliophilic topics with plots in which the boundaries between the narrated reality and the complete literary fiction are blurred. So, for example, the protagonists of the story suddenly become aware that they are not real persons, but they are just protagonists of a written story, and things like that. And so it is also with this novel. A series of mysterious deaths in a bookstore leads the investigator, who is, by the way, a police officer who also has a degree in literature. That leads him into contact with the bibliomaniac doomsday sect. It entangles him with the machinations of the National Agency for Security, and there's also a mysterious tea shop with a telepathically gifted shop owner. And so real crazy stuff, but in the positive sense. And it's the first part of a trilogy around the same investigator. Each one also readable as a standalone book, but I'd recommend this one as the starting point. So this is not Nobel Prize winning great literature, but very original and intelligent entertainment, especially for book nerds, for lovers of bookish bibliophilic topics, and for lovers of skillful play with narrative concepts. Really an ideal book for boring, rainy February weekends. Number 2, the book I read on my Kindle, Giorgio Scerbanenco, Venere Privata. The title of the English translation from 2012 is A Private Venus. This book is from 1966, and it's the first crime novel in the Duca Lamberti series of this half Ukrainian, half Italian author, who really revolutionized the Italian crime fiction scene in the 1960s. He was also called the Italian father of the noir. He was mostly forgotten during the 1980s and 90s, but luckily there has been a renaissance and rediscovery of his works in recent years. The crime novel Venere Privata, or Private Venus, marks the beginning of his successful series around a former medical doctor named Duca Lamberti, and Scerbanenco does not shy away from topics that were at that time either considered highly controversial or even taboo in Italy of the 1960s. The main investigator, Duca Lamberti, is a medical doctor who has lost his license to practice medicine because he had to serve a prison sentence for a medically assisted suicide of a terminally ill patient. And so he has a lot of free time to spend, and he's quickly drawn into the investigation around the exploitation and also the murder of young women by the porn industry, which was still operating completely illegally at that time. So it's an interesting insight into the sometimes contradictory Italy of the 1960s, but it is not at all old-fashioned nor outdated. It reads like a very fresh and captivating crime novel. Number 3. I enjoyed very much Marcovaldo by Italo Calvino. The English translation, The Seasons in the City, was published in 1963. This is an uncharacteristically light-footed and short and accessible work by Calvino. It's a collection of 20 short stories that are very light-hearted in tone and sometimes downright funny, but underneath this surface there is a subtle social critique and above all a criticism of the alienation of city dwellers from nature and from a more natural way of living. The protagonist is Marcovaldo, a simple laborer who actually comes from a small rural background and now lives in a highly industrialized city in northern Italy. Marcovaldo lives there together with his family, with his wife and his children, and he has retained his childlike wonder at nature and at people, and he's now looking for ways to revive this nature experience of his childhood days in the big city, but he repeatedly fails in a mostly comical way. For example, in one of the stories, the mushrooms that he jealously guards and protects and grooms at a bus stop finally land him in hospital with mushroom poisoning. And the romantic moonlit night on a park bench is completely ruined by the municipal garbage collection teams and the blinding lights and horns of the city and so on. Cheerful but also slightly melancholy work with one twinkling and one weeping eye, and it's a good read for a cozy summer evening on the terrace, best taken together with a good Italian wine, of course. Let's get to the books in German. Number 4, Hans Fallada, Kleiner Mann was nun, available in English as Little Man, What Now? It's a social novel in the tradition of the so-called German New Objectivity, published in 1932. That's just 1 year before the Nazis seized power in Germany. Frequent topics of this new objectivity movement were the challenges of the German society in the Weimar Republic, characterized by the economic and psychological consequences of the First World War and the Great Depression, and the huge impact of the rising technologies on everyday life, the political radicalization of the society. And against this backdrop, the struggle, in particular of the so-called little people, to come to terms with these challenges and to create a life worth living. So this brings us directly to the core of the plot. We follow the unemployed Johannes Pinneberg and his wife Lämmchen, who are starting a family in this situation. So they will get their first son, nicknamed Murkel, and try to make ends meet somehow in the situation. We experience a first-hand description of the difficulties that the Pinnebergs face, just to get a small one-bedroom apartment in a backyard and eking out a living with odd jobs, and most importantly, just putting food on the table, and maintaining a zest for life and a touch of optimism despite all these challenges. A very realistic look at the everyday life of the little man in Germany and at this crucial time. Number 5, Jeremias Gotthelf, short stories and novellas. I'd like to focus on the novella Black Spider from 1842 as an example. I had always steered clear of the Swiss author Jeremias Gotthelf because I had always labeled him as a complacent, boring, and overly saintly author of the rural Swiss mountain farmer idyll. Just by chance, I came across a volume of his novellas and short stories, and I was proved wrong. especially by the novella The Black Spider, which is also available in English translation by the as part of the New York Review of Books series. I was surprised that he can also be an author of the fantastical, of the creepy, and of the uncanny. But the plot, on the occasion of a christening in a Swiss village, the grandfather of the newly baptized child tells an old legend. It is about a pact with the devil under this disguise of a wild hunter that the villagers made in an act of desperation to save themselves from the oppression of a tyrannical lord of the local castle. But when the inhabitants of the village refuse to deliver their part of the bargain, which involves handing over an unbaptized child, the village is infested by a black spider and its offspring that stalks and cruelly kills both livestock and humans. And here Gotthelf shows himself to be a master of the uncanny, of the gruesome, and also as a very precise observer of the dynamics of collective guilt and how this affects the social structures and relationships in the village community. The interweaving of the frame story and different levels of internal narration is done very skillful without appearing overly artificial. And so this is really a slightly disturbing but a great novella that will linger in your memory for long. Moving on to English books. I do have a soft spot for Victorian literature, and so I read The Egoist by George Meredith this year, and this was actually my first, but definitely not my last book by George Meredith. In a nutshell, it's a story of the very self-absorbed Sir Willoughby Patterne, a dyed-in-the-wool egoist and narcissist, and his attempts at marriage. He had been jilted by his first bride, and now he's wavering between a sentimental Letitia Dale, who has always blindly adored him since her youth, on one hand, and on the other hand, the more strong-willed Clara Middleton, the daughter of a retired country clergyman, who very much wants his daughter to marry Sir Willoughby, primarily for economic reasons and also, shall we say, for his own selfish reasons, because he has a very weak spot. He has a very soft spot for vintage port, and his future son-in-law has a very well-assorted wine cellar. So there is an engagement between Sir Willoughby and Clara Middleton, rather hastily, and then the plot revolves around Clara's increasingly desperate attempts to break away from this hasty engagement to Sir Willoughby, because she now becomes aware and actually detests his brutal selfishness and narcissism. But breaking off the engagement seems to be almost impossible. In addition to very highly nuanced character studies, the novel offers also a really harrowing picture of how unfree women were in Victorian society, because they can ultimately be traded like a thing between fathers and husbands to satisfy their own selfish motives. And for non-native readers, the English is a bit more difficult than most other Victorian writers I've read so far, due to sometimes very complex structure of the sentences and quite a few rare and outdated words, but it's still manageable to be read with great pleasure. Number 7, Thomas Hardy, Jude the Obscure, which I found in this nice antiquarian volume from 1927. This is admittedly a somewhat gloomy novel about a young stonemason with a passion for education, who is self-taught, but in a very unsystematic way. And he is under the illusion that he can finally make it into the educated classes. And however, he fails because of the very status-conscious and elitist and exclusive society, which does not really take him seriously and ultimately drives him to ruin, taking also his whole family with him. This is a flaming indictment of the exclusivity of the upper classes in the Victorian society, and exclusivity in the truest sense of the word, as excluding anyone who does not belong to this group by virtue of birth or money. And so that is not a story for the faint-hearted reader, nor for sentimental readers, because there are really some heart-wrenching scenes, but for the connoisseur of Victorian literature, this is a must-read. Moving on to Yiddish, number 8, Katja Molodovsky, von Lublin bis New York, from 1942, translated into English under the title A Jewish Refugee in New York by the Indiana University Press. I have already introduced briefly this book in my video on the university tag. Katja Molodovsky is considered one of the most important Yiddish poetess of the 20th century. So she wrote very little in prose, and this one is certainly her best known work of prose. It is the fictional diary of a 20-year-old Polish Jewess who flees from Nazi-occupied Germany in December 1939 to live with her relatives in New York. And in this diary, she describes in a very simple but impressive scenes her attempts to find a new home in America. It's about everyday life, everyday scenes, her feeling of alienation towards her American relatives who live so differently and are strongly assimilated to the American way of life, about American society, which she perceives as being very superficial, her keen but exhausting attempts to learn English and to find a job, and at the same time her processing of all the terrible news that she receives from her old homeland Poland and from her friends and relatives in Europe. So it's a very moving and unfortunately never published in German. I have this reprint on demand of the Yiddish original here. It is absolutely worth reading, and the Yiddish is a very simple one intentionally, because it should reflect the way a 20-year-old girl writes a diary. So it's also perfectly fine to be read by students of Yiddish at an intermediate level. Number 9, French. French books I always have to read in parallel, the original text on my Kindle and the German translation in parallel. I read Alain-Fournier, Le Grand Morne, The Great Morne. The latest English translation was published by Penguin as The Lost Estate and by Oxford University Press as The Lost Domain. Originally published in 1913, this is the only complete novel by the French author Alain-Fournier, who unfortunately died in the First World War at the age of 27. It is an attempt to reconstruct from memory a key period of the protagonist's teenage years. And the story is told from the perspective of a 13-year-old, François Sorel, the son of a village school teacher whose life takes a new turn when a new classmate is admitted to the school, somewhat mysterious and somehow different outsider, Augustin, only called the Great Morne because he's slightly older, slightly taller, but above all, much more adventurous and daring than his classmates. One day, Augustin Morne goes on a secret excursion. He gets lost and ends up at a mysterious castle where preparations are underway for the wedding of the castle owner's son. And the wedding is to be celebrated as a fantastic costume party for children, but actually the wedding itself never happens. It is cancelled because the bride doesn't turn up. And so Mons returns to the village school. He is very passionate about this castle and really infects François Sorel with his enthusiasm. But unfortunately, he no longer knows how he got to that castle. And so the two together begin their secret attempts to reconstruct Mohn's journey and to find the castle and its inhabitants. And when, after much effort, they finally succeed by chance, the reality turns out to be quite different from what they had hoped and what Augustin had remembered. This is a beautiful little work about early passion, about the magic of childhood, the power of memory, and I think it is rightly often described as a precursor to Marcel Proust's monumental work, In Search of Lost Time. Number 10, Claude Tillier, My Uncle Benjamin from 1843. The English translation was published in 1930. Here we have the strange situation that this little humorous satirical novel is still popular in Germany by the German reading public, and it is published again and again. But in the author's homeland, France, it is hardly widespread. After 1930, there have been only very small, very limited editions by luxury publishers. It is a story written in a cheerfully satirical tone of the somewhat eccentric great-uncle Benjamin of the narrator, and this Uncle Benjamin lives in rural France together with his sister's family, and he is very proud of being a bachelor, and he loves good wine and witty conversations, and he has nothing against a little flirtation with the pretty local innkeeper, but he uses a lot of tricks and subterfuge to evade all his sister's attempts to arrange a marriage with the daughter of the doctor in the neighboring village. And this is not high literature about existential human issues, but an entertaining read for a dreamy Sunday afternoon in a hammock, preferably with a bottle of French cider, of course. That's it for today. Thanks for watching this video. If you like that kind of stuff, please subscribe or leave me a comment. I'd love to know whether you have already read any of these books or authors and how you think about it. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye and ciao.